Hello! Over the course of this series, we have talked a lot about 1 Corinthians 15, which makes sense. The debate topic here is whether or not there were groups of people who claim to have seen the risen Christ. It says right there in 1 Corinthians 15 that a ginormous group of people saw the risen Christ. However, other documents also give reports of multiple eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus, like the 4 Gospels, Acts, 1 Clement, the letters of Ignatius, and so on. In this video, we're going to focus on the 4 Gospels and how they can corroborate the tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. The first question we're going to ask is if the Gospels are independent of the message given by Paul. If they're not, then they would not corroborate each other. Fortunately, though, the Gospels and 1 Corinthians are independent, as even Apologia admits. Dale Allison notes regarding the 1 Corinthians tradition that its distance from the canonical accounts is often emphasized. There are no women in Paul's account, for example, and the Gospels intimate nothing of an appearance to James. Yet, Allison also notes the existence of sequential similarities: death, burial, resurrection on the 3rd day, appearance to individuals, and then appearance to 11 or 12 disciples. So, while independent, both the Gospels and Paul's account contain a motif of group appearances, and therefore corroborate the existence of these eyewitnesses. Now, even though Apologia accepts that the 4 Gospels are indeed independent from Paul's account, he argues that they are not independent of each other. While this is quite debatable, granting it wouldn't negate Loke's argument. Paul's tradition is still receiving independent corroboration. Annette Mears and Gerd Thiessen put it this way: the credibility of this tradition is enhanced because it is in part confirmed by the narrative tradition, which is independent, and because in the case of Paul, we have the personal testimony of an eyewitness who knew many of the other witnesses. Now, let's turn from Loke's argument that the independence of the Gospels corroborates Paul's tradition, and look at another of Loke's arguments. He argues that there must have been solid evidence available to the early Christians to create widespread belief in the resurrection. An objection raised by Apologia, via citing Dale Allison, is that we don't know what the disciples actually saw because the authors of the Gospels and Acts might have apologetics purpose in portraying what they saw. So, the line of thinking here is that the Gospel authors already had a belief in the resurrection, and they wanted other people to believe in it, so they just made up evidence. Interestingly enough, Loke's argument that the early church would have had solid evidence available to them isn't affected by this worry, since Loke's argument for this is independent of the Gospels themselves. Remember, Allison started out with the authors of the Gospels already believing in the resurrection, but where did that belief come from? Even more importantly, there was widespread and persistent belief in the resurrection very early on. Where did it all come from? Well, such widespread belief would have been very hard to form if there was no solid evidence presented to anyone that such a resurrection had indeed occurred. Even bereavement experiences caused by the death of a loved one rarely leads to people actually forming the belief that their loved one has risen from the dead. To cause a widespread and persistent belief that someone has risen bodily from the dead, rather than a vision or a spirit, it is likely that solid evidence would be required, such as evidence that it was a solid, physical body seen by a group of people. None of that requires the Gospels to be trustworthy, but they do confirm this argument by containing exactly what the argument contends should be in them. Solid evidence that Jesus rose, like eating with him and touching him, is what generates their belief in his resurrection. That's not to say the Gospels are untrustworthy. There are indeed good reasons to trust them, just that Loke's argument here is unaffected by any such worry. Now, I think that what we've gone over through this series does a pretty good job presenting Loke's opening statement and rebutting the brunt of Apologia's arguments. On screen is a summary of the arguments we've covered in a syllogistic form. If this series continues, we'll probably go into an assessment of Apologia's opening statement and Loke's first rebuttal. I also want to encourage you to download Loke's free book if you're interested in the rest of this case for the resurrection, but that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this content.